Well, hello, everyone. Welcome back to our seminar. Today, we have Professor Ian Savage. He has been a faculty member of both the Department of Economics and Transportation at Northwestern since 1986. And his research interests primarily include public transportation and transportation safety. He holds a bachelor's degree in economics from the University of Sheffield and a doctorate degree in transportation economics from the University of Leeds. Today, he's going to talk about a very interesting topic, and I'm not going to tell you about it, and I don't want to spoil it for him. So help me welcome the professor.
Hey. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for inviting me. Normally for my research, I do work on transportation safety and urban transit. So this is a little bit off the wall for what I'm doing, but maybe I should tell you a little bit about how this work came about. My co-author, Max here, is currently is a pre-doctoral research assistant at the University of Chicago. And this project started when he was an undergraduate senior at Northwestern, and this started and evolved into what we're going to show you today from his undergraduate senior honors paper in economics. So Max is about to apply and to become part of an MD PhD program somewhere. So as a doctor and a researcher. So I mean, this is what he does for his day job as well, but obviously doing stuff on health research nowadays. So Max in some ways was a great researcher and a true co-author on this. So I'll show you about it. So the title is kind of pretty self-explanatory. I'm going to say a couple of things and then I'm going to get straight to the result. I know what time constraints we have. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you what we found and then we can discuss how we did it based on your interest, and also recognize this is an interdisciplinary seminar and I'm an economist, so I want to make this as broad as possible. So I've got the converse to get it going. And that should work. Okay, so there were two papers that came out of this. The first one was it's an economics journal that deals with short submission type quick turnaround. We did that soon after Max's work. And then we did a more detailed thing, which is I'm going to be primarily talking about today, which was we went to revise and resubmit, and it just got published in the last month. So we've got some stuff which is pretty close to hot off the presses here. So so a quick talk about what some of you, of course, lived through this, so you know roughly what was going on. So what Delta Airlines was doing at that time is that they were in an aircraft where you had sort of 3 seats next to each other. They wouldn't be selling the middle seat at all unless you were in a party of 3. And if you were in the places where there were 2 seats, so here's a map of one of their 717s. As soon as if you were traveling by yourself and you booked a seat there, then they would just withdraw the seat whose sale was next to you. So basically, you can think of this middle seat is basically a shorthand for what would you do not to have to sit next to a stranger? Because you could always sit next to somebody you know, right? So that's what we do it. So a little bit about when this policy was in effect. So this is TSA checkpoint data. And as you can see, things fell off a cliff pretty quickly in March of 2020. Kind of took a long time to recover, and of course, you know, this went through basically a 2-year period, but we know that this summer's been pretty busy, right? So the clear policy I'm going to talk about is the fact that in the sort of 3 months from sort of April through June of 2020, all of the major airlines were either implicitly or explicitly not selling the middle seat. As you can see, there were so few people actually traveling. Whether you had a policy or not really didn't matter because there was nobody on the plane anyway. Okay. Now, what changed was that after the end of June 2020, going through the spring of 2021, Delta Airlines maintained this policy of not selling the middle seat I've described, but the other 2 airlines started selling it. So you actually, as a consumer, had a real choice here, right? You could fly where the seat was being blocked next to you, or you could travel on an airline where you were rolling the dice as to whether the seat was occupied or not, right? So I did want to sort of say that this wasn't just sort of a theoretical restriction here. This is the domestic load factor, so percent of seats occupied in reality on these airlines. Delta is the one in blue. So you see in the period between the red lines, which is where the airlines differed in their policies, Delta actually had a load factor of 40 to 50%, where American and United were up 60%, some cases north of 70%, right? So in reality, even though demand was down, so was capacity, seats were being filled. You see, even when Delta finished their policy in the spring of 2021, when the vaccines were more widely available, it took up into the summer of 2021 before Delta's load factors sort of got back into the same range that Americans and Delta as well. So what's kind of exciting as an economist here is here we have a policy where not only in theory were they restricting sale of middle seat, but in reality we saw that they're much lower capacity, filling of their capacity. So what I was going to be interested in is what did this do for Delta Airlines? And more particularly, if you think about, you know, what were people willing perhaps to pay to have more space on the airplane? Right? And, you know, sit next to someone coughing on them or something, right? You know? And here we might have a natural experiment for it. So the very first paper, which I'm going to kind of breeze through to get to the more detailed one, was that we took a sample of about 1,400 domestic routes, and we were looking at the fact that either one of American, Delta, or United, at least one of them had to be present on each of these routes, okay? And then we tried to look at whether the average fare was going to be higher on the routes that Delta was serving during the period they differed from American and United relative to routes where Delta was not present. So that's kind of what we're doing. So we had a kind of natural experiment here. We had a time series based on quarterly data, a period before the pandemic, and a period towards the end where they differed in their policy. And we had some routes where Delta was present, some routes where Delta wasn't present, some cases Delta was present, so it was American or United, right? And we could try to see if Delta was charging a higher price. Okay? And we're using something which is actually very common in applied economics here, these so-called differences equations, which is a rather fancy term for saying which is not that much different from a linear regression, taking advantage of the fact that we have a control group, American United, and a treatment group, Delta, and we have a period before the action and a period after. So this is used in lots of areas of economics. You think of some social policy when you do it to a certain group of recipients and not to a control group, you see if their behavior changes. So this is basically why differences is important. You choose a before and an after period. You have a treatment group and a control period. And then usually you throw in a bunch of factors, you know, route fixed effects, which are going to be constant across time, and maybe some time fixed effects. For example, we know during the pandemic, the prices fell for everyone. And the question is, you know, given the fact the airline prices fell, well, maybe it fell a bit less for Delta than for the other two. So that's what we're trying to do with these differences of equations. Okay, so we ran a regression. So what I'm going to do is I'm not going to show you the regression, because when I show people regressions, there's a screen here, which is a long way away from you, with a whole bunch of numbers in 10-point font, which you can't see. And God knows what it's telling you. So I actually took it to plot what was going on. So what we see is that for both American United, which are the red ones, and for Delta, this was the average one-way fare on these routes. So the survey, right? And we see that during the pandemic, in Q1 of 2020, prices fell, right? On this, the average fare beforehand was about $220, and prices were falling by, well, at least $60, yeah, right? But what you notice is that where United and American were different from Delta, particularly in this period, where one had a middle seat policy and one didn't, Delta was actually now charging price premium. So the price when it was down, so much less than before the pandemic, was higher than American and United were charging by about 15%. So Delta seemed to be extracting price premium. Yeah. So this was paper one. Any questions about that? We'll go to paper two, which is a lot more deals with other things as well. Okay, so this is the second paper, we did a couple of things in additional. We argued that not only could there be a difference in price, which it did seem to be so, but maybe Delta could have got market share going out to this, right? You know, which isn't necessarily clear. That's obviously charging a higher price, which would discourage some people. But maybe a lot of people like the fact that they didn't have someone sitting next to them, and Delta could score some market share gain out of that. We did that. In our second paper, we had the first quarter of 2021, which was the final quarter where American and United differed from Delta. And then we actually focused in on a bunch of routes. Before I read this, 1,400 routes. And to be honest, many of these routes, either American, Delta, or United dominated that route. I mean, obviously, the airline industry is kind of competitive. If you think about individual routes, let's take a route from Chicago to Fargo, North Dakota. Okay? Maybe only United's in that market. Now you can get to Fargo, right? You might have to go through Minneapolis on Delta. There is competition, but if you're looking at just a non-stop flight from Fargo to Chicago, usually just one firm dominates. So of that 1,400 routes, many of these routes have just one firm. Well, what was interesting to us is that when you had this middle seat policy, what would be interesting for some customers is you could either choose the airline that did sell the middle seat or those that didn't. You know, you've got a direct choice. So we narrowed in on a bunch of surprisingly small number of routes, 54 routes in the lower 48 states where Delta had to be present for all of the quarters, pre-pandemic and during the pandemic. And at least one of American and United has to be present as well. So customers had a real choice. And the competitor had to be there for all 13 quarters as well. This is a pretty small number of routes, in my opinion. It's truly competitive. I think some of what happened is that in the early stages of the pandemic, the airlines pulled back their schedules. So a lot of routes where normally there would be competition, particularly United, just pulled service out of it. So we didn't have continuous data, but here we did. So we're looking at fares and market share, which we based on the ticket database. And we're looking at the fact that Delta had to be present all quarters, and they had to have a competitor. Now, I do want to sort of just give you a little bit of economic theory before we talk about the results. Think of any choice you have in life, right? You and I would probably both agree that not sitting next to someone on an airplane is better than sitting next to someone, right? Someone you don't know in the middle seat, right? Things like that, right? So we probably all agree this is kind of good, right? But then if you get faced with the choices that, hey, you know, you not have to sit next to one, but you have to pay an extra 15%, then you might say, well, you know, maybe I don't value it that much, right? You know, so people are going to split themselves between the two things. And in economics, we call this vertical differentiation. So differentiating on quality. So if you think about that, if we had all these customers and we kind of distribute their value of the trip, because some people might say during the pandemic, you know, a lot of people decide, hey, I'm not going to make a trip at all. I'm just going to stay home, I'm going to drive, or something like that. So some people will take the trip depending on the value of it. And also the concerns about the virus, because you would imagine the people who wanted to pay more on Delta would be the people you would expect had the most concern about contracting the virus, perhaps, right? So what happens in these sorts of models is that if all of the firms were offering the same product, like always, sometimes there will be people who will stay home and not just take air travel, or they would drive or take Amtrak or whatever else they would do. Some people would fly. And for the people who fly, the people who value the trip high, You know, if you're very concerned about the virus, you'd be less likely to travel, right? Because you're going to stay home or something like that, right? And you would share the market between you. Now, when Delta kind of breaks from the herd here, what ends up happening is you end up with some sort of break point here where the people who are most concerned about the virus will go with Delta. People who are less concerned about the virus will join with the crowd on American United, and you split the market. And what's kind of interesting here is not only sort of splitting the market, you know, and this is a fairly common thing in economics, you know. Some people dine at high-end restaurants, some people dine at McDonald's, right? There's nothing wrong with either of those choices. You just make the choice of where you want to go, price and quality, right? You know. But what's interesting here is you've got a little segment of people here who, if you had been selling the middle seat, these people would not have wanted to fly on the airplane. But because Delta was doing this, maybe you felt more reassured. Maybe you decided you want to fly as a result of that. So there's a little segment here in the way these economic models work, where Delta would actually not only sort of be stealing some customers from American United who are concerned about the virus, but would also steal some people who otherwise would travel. Yeah, so this is kind of how the model works. So that's kind of the theory. Let's talk about what actually happened in life, right? When we ran these regressions. So remember beforehand, we had a similar graph to this, but there it was at 1,400 routes, many of which were monopolies. So remember, these are now a smaller number of routes which are competitors. It's no surprise that fares in general are lower because these are more competitive routes, okay? But like before, we see the fact that, you know, prices certainly fell during the pandemic, right, for everyone. So they fell less for Delta's routes on routes, prices Delta charge on these routes than they did for their competitor, American United. So the difference between these two things here is about $12.50, which is about 10%. So remember, we had about 15% when we had that large section of routes. But remember, many of those are routes where either Delta isn't even on the route, or when they are, Delta might have monopoly power there. So these are competitive routes. So you might expect the price premium that Delta could extract in a competitive world would be a place where you could extract a lower price premium. So we were basically finding out that Delta was able to charge about $12.50 each way, and that was about 10% markup. So $25 round trip, right? Just going okay with the technical problem. Things working okay? Yeah, cool. Okay. Okay. Those of you who might have listened to what I just said, like, you might say to yourself, well, that's the side, right? Two things could be going on here. It's a nice implication, which is supported with the premise of our paper, is that people on Delta, like the fact they didn't have to sit next to someone, were willing to pay a higher price and actually did pay a higher price, right? But somebody else might say, well, there's something going on here. What's going on here is because the plane has less seats you're selling. You know how airlines price seats, right? You start at a high price and, you know, high price and low price, you know, and people with the lowest price bucket sells out and move to the next group, right? If you have less seats, maybe you have to discount the price far less to fill up the last few seats on the flight. So maybe that's what's going on here. This isn't the fact that we know people like not sitting next to someone, but maybe it's a capacity type story. That's a good point. So one thing we did was we actually looked at the deciles. So we did the previous graph showed what the average fare was on each route. So we now looked at the 10th decile, 20th decile, and things like that. And we had, this is the busiest table I have here, right? So the 10th decile means that you're looking at the distribution of fares being charged by American and Delta and American United, right? You look at the sort of the bottom 10% of them, look what that point is, right? And then you do the same 20% level and you get to 50% over, which would be the median fare, right? What's kind of interesting here is apart from the fact that the very bottom of the market here, where in general, there doesn't seem to be too much difference between the price that Delta's charging and others. Maybe these are contract fares or promotional fares, government fares, and things like that. In general, the premium Delta was able to extract was somewhere in the sort of $12, $13, $17 range, right? Which means that the El Cheapo people get far hit with a far higher premium than a higher price, right? So the actual markup is about the same-ish in dollar terms, but it means percentage-wise it's much higher for the lower. This could be consistent with the argument that basically what Delta didn't have to do is they didn't have to sell so many cheap fares, and they could just fill their plane with people who were willing to pay the general higher price, pandemic or no pandemic. So, I think that probably is not the whole story. And one of the reasons we find out is the fact that Delta was certainly withholding probably a third and sixth on the flight. That's certainly true, right? But what Delta did at the same time was they actually ran far more flights. So they actually restored their schedule far quicker than American, and particularly United did, right? One thing we find is that American initially restored their schedule. Then they started putting their schedule back to push the load factors up, profitability reasons, right? And United was very slow in putting service back in. So if we look at sort of on these 54 routes, what a measure of the number of flights was, we're finding that if you talk, before the first quarter, before the real pandemic hit, Jane called out 100. Number of departures, Delta by the first quarter of 2021 were back to about 70% of the schedule, whereas American and United were barely at 50% of their schedule back. So Delta was flying a lot more flights. Aircraft size really didn't change all that much. If you regard the fact that Delta was certainly not selling surface seats, right? That's certainly true. If we kind of correct in a sort of very crude fashion for that, the effective seating inventory that Delta was putting out was not that different from American and United, a little bit less than American, but certainly more than United. So the argument that what we're seeing was the price going up because you were rationing scarce capacity probably doesn't hold water when you look at the fact that Delta was putting out a whole bunch of extra capacity. That's my argument there. Let's talk about market share. Now, a couple of observations here, right? First of all, remember we had to have Delta there in every quarter. So it's not surprising this is Delta's core network in general. There's no wonder they have a higher market share in general. Our market share here is defined as not only Delta, but American United, plus if there's any other airlines in there as well, which would be Spirit, Frontier, Sun Country, Southwest, JetBlue. These guys will be in there as well. Generally, most of those didn't have big market shares in there, but they were present. Okay? What we're observing going on here is that American United seem to be starting to lose market share during the pandemic. Partly what's going on here is, if you remember, business travel really got hit during the pandemic, but leisure travel, particularly on Florida and Colorado routes, recovered much quicker, or didn't drop as much, right? And to be honest, those were the markets where the Spirits of this world cater to that sort of crowd, right? So in general, we see that Delta didn't have that experience. It kind of went the other way. But a lot of what was being lost here was not necessarily going to Delta, but it was sort of leisure travel going to Spirits and JetBlue and people like this, right? So what we observed actually when we broke this down was that the Delta beforehand, when we did a regression, so obviously I'm not showing you the regression results, was that all of the legacy airlines, American, Delta, and United, took a market share hit during the pandemic. And this is primarily because business travel got decimated, leisure travel less so, okay? But Delta, by its middle seat policy, managed to make up for the sort of the negative effect, which affected all three legacy airlines, actually boosted their market share enough to overcome the negative effect and push it back into positive territory again. Right? So Delta did manage to gain market share here and gain market share at a time when there was a whole bunch of headwinds. Right? Now, you may say to me again, it was fine, well, that's very nice person salary, right? But Delta was offering two things here. It was offering the fact you didn't have to sit next to a stranger. And the other thing it was offering was the fact that it had a more, it built back the schedule a lot quicker than American United, right? So that means that when you think about buying an airline flight, you are thinking about, how convenient the schedule to my preferred departure times. It's that sort of departure time model and matching against that. So we actually introduced a variable measuring what we called what it is in these sorts of models, people gravitate and you assume people want to depart evenly across the day and they have to kind of move to the closest departure time often by the airline. So we had a variable measuring this. And when we did that, we found that the let's see what we call schedule delay here. So schedule delay, remember, is the fact that I've some undergraduates this, right? If you go and get the bus, right? You show up at the bus stop and you have to wait for the bus, right? That's a true waiting time, right? But even if you know the schedule and you show up when the bus, just before the bus comes, maybe you want to get the bus at 1:30, but the bus doesn't come to 1:45, right? So you've got 15 minutes shifted in time, which you're not necessarily standing at the bus stop for. You just have to adjust your day, right? This is schedule. So you put that. And when we introduced that, we actually found that the middle seat policy, when we took off the schedule delay, we pulled it down by about one point something percentage points. This middle seat policy boosted Delta's market share by about 3.5 percentage points. Okay. Remember, that's against the headwind of 2.5 percentage points down simply because they're a legacy airline. So the net effect here was that probably gained just over 1 percentage point market share. So one thing which would mean, if this had actually worked out, this would have been a kick-butt paper, right? But unfortunately, this bit didn't work out, right? Which is the fact that these fare premium market share gains, it would be fantastic if they've been correlated with certain characteristics of the route. Like, for example, Delta operates out of Atlanta and Salt Lake City, also New York City as well, right? People in the Northeast are more concerned about the virus. We know that because the vaccine take-up was greater than it was in Georgia or in Utah, okay? And it would be kind of nice if in New York, they were able to extract a higher price premium and got more of a market share gain because there are a whole bunch of people who have been worried about the virus in other parts of the country and they'd be less concerned. So we tried to run this against, say, weighted average vaccine take-up at the end of the round. And we couldn't find anything. I think the big reason why we did it, in my personal opinion, is that the places with the highest vaccine take-up, which are primarily in the Northeast, was the places where most of the traffic was business travel. And that just got destroyed, right? And the places where travel was more buoyant, Florida, beach vacation type places, right? This is where it didn't fall quite so much. So I think that was kind of messing with these results. It's kind of annoying. So this really got some nice results on that. We'd have probably seen a far better job, right? But it didn't. It was great. This is a fantastic paper. This would have been a kick-butt paper if we did this. We could have put this in the American Economics review. We found something like this, right? So anyway, so a little bit of summary here. What we observed on these competitive routes, unlike that bigger set of routes, is that Delta was able to charge about a 10% price premium result, and it was able to improve its market share probably with some people defecting from American United, that's right. And some people who otherwise would be reluctant to fly. So we did see, against these headwinds, a little bit of market share gain as well. And what actually I thought was kind of nice at the end of the day is that sometimes you run regressions, you get these results, and your results don't even pass the sniff test. You can't, the magnitudes just seem unbelievably small or unbelievably large. These can't be real. And what was it kind of I liked about this paper was the results actually were in the bounds of believability, I would say, right? Which is always nice when you do empirical work, right? So the big question is, you know, why did Delta do this? Was this a good idea? I mean, I think there's a couple of things, right? I mean, why were doing? Were they just being altruistic? Were they hoping to get some sort of positive image which might carry on afterwards? I mean, if you talk to Delta, part of what they say is that, hey, we might have had some frequent flyers who used to be American and United customers who tried us during this period. Maybe they liked what they saw compared with what they used to with American and you know, inertia of people's choices between airlines. Maybe we gained some people for the long run. One view. Another view is that, which is certainly true, they're running more of their schedule. And I think certainly compared with America, and maybe so with Finland, you know, United, maybe they managed to keep more of their pilots in hours, you know, and certified, less of their aircraft out of long-term storage, so that when demand did pick up, and it picked up really rapidly, they might be in a better position. You know, we've been through an awful summer of air travel here, right? With people adjusting back their capacity, right? Another thing I was thinking about is, as an economist, is that during the time they were doing this, there were huge federal payouts to the airlines, like about 30% of operating costs were coming from it. Maybe it alters the way you view the marginal cost of running a flight. If someone else is paying 30% of your operating costs, right? You know? But I think in the end, you know, as soon as the vaccines became widely available, Delta dumped this policy. And for those who've been around long enough, we can remember when Americans tried the same thing 20 years ago. There they were doing seat pitch, they were pulling rows out of aircraft. It lasted about 4 years until we started running into an oil price run-up when they jumped it here. So maybe in reality, people are willing to pay an extra 10, 20 bucks for a bit more space around them, right? But that's not enough to make it worthwhile in a sort of general sense for these airlines. That's kind of my conclusion here. So I know that we had a time constraint. I know I wanted to talk to you. This is what I found. I can tell you more about what we did. I think we've got 15 minutes to have a conversation here about what we did here, what we found. Floor is open. Yes, please.
Thank you, Professor, for the nice presentation. So my question is, maybe I'm not sure if this is like very relevant to the result, but did the pricing policies change before the pandemic and afterwards? For example, like did say Delta want to just keep business running without like getting a lot of profit, because like at the start you showed that they eliminated around 30 to 40% of the seats.
Right.
And yet they were available to increase the prices only by 10%. Or is this a byproduct of like gaining more market share?
Okay, so I need to repeat part of the question so the Zoom people can hear what's going on. So the question here is, how does this compare beforehand and coming out of the pandemic? So remembering when we did this work, right? And so we were doing this, the first version was submitted in the journal paper in the fall of 2001. Okay? We're using quarterly fare data, which gets released with a lag. So we were certainly comparing beforehand. And this is a difference in differences technique. So you're observing whether Delta had a price premium over American United in a period in 2018 and 2019. Before the pandemic, and then the period when they differed in their policies. So you're training your data by looking at before and after study. What this study is not, which would be an interesting study to do, which would be the next thing, is when that policy went away, what happened there? No, it's all during the pandemic period, and then back when they both went back to selling all this things, right? So we didn't do that. I mean, you would need to have, you know, maybe a year's worth or more of data afterwards, so which will take you through maybe even this roundabout now, right? So this the data for the fair data is not going to be available for Q3 of 2022 until sometime next spring. So I mean, that's why we say that. So, I mean, but the difference in different technique requires you to be able to observe the difference between the treatment group and the control group in the before period, and then something happens to one of the groups, right? So this is the comparison we're doing. So, answer some of your questions, at least how I would have answered. I hope you're interested in combining some of what we're doing. This is, as I say, this is a very common technique in economics, which maybe you guys should think about as well in terms of your own work. You know, you always want to have some sort of natural experiment where certain people are treated in a certain way. You think like traveler information system, how people get through networks, right? You have the people with the information, the people who didn't have the information. You need to know how those people behaved before you even started doing this to see if they were different in some observable way beforehand. So this is become very common in applied macroeconomics. Yeah. So yeah, but
yeah, great presentation. Thank you so much. This is really interesting. I have two questions. The first one, I've always heard this theory. I don't know any evidence to back it up, but I've always heard this theory that airlines want to keep economy class bad enough of an experience that the people who are on the fence between buying a higher class of travel will always buy it, right? Mm-hmm. So if economy class becomes too nice, those people will just stay in economy. So when you talk about market share, is that specifically is that for all fare classes? And if so, does that somewhat disprove that theory in that Delta made economy class substantially better in that you never have to sit next to a stranger, but they actually still gained market share over American and United, who had the same experience as always?
So that's a good question. So the question, there's two questions there. Question two was which I'm going to answer first, which is a data question, is that our fare data here was for all classes of tickets, which would include potentially first class tickets, which of course are relatively few in number, right? But then for all fare restrictions, from unrestricted coach to full coach, I mean, in the airline database, you can probably pull out first class tickets. And you know, they do the DOT transportation screens out tickets they regard as unreliable data, right? You know, so all tickets are in, right? The other question, which is a very interesting thing, which is, do you keep economy class bad for certain reasons, right? I would say that sort of industrial organization economists, the big discussion you always have when you do price discrimination is how do you stop the people who are willing to pay higher prices from getting away from paying the low price, right? It's the whole thing, you know? Verizon and all these people, this is the thing they deal in life, right? You know, or Comcast, right? How do we have the people who are willing to pay hundreds of dollars a month, not taking out advantage of our $39.99 special, right? You know? And like that. So that's always a big question. Right? I mean, so you have to differentiate the product, right? One is ways by differentiating quality is the fact that the people who pay for the premium seats, you're doing two things. A, you're extracting a premium because it's higher physical quality, right? You know? But you're probably also extracting a price premium from these people because they're the most price inelastic. And they're the people who have the highest willingness to pay, and by making sure that when you were going to fly on the flights, and you said, man, I really could fly for $25 there, then you say, my God, this would be awful, right? You know, now I'm going to pay it 150, right? You know, and that's the way you do it. So, I mean, I think all businesses, I've seen one of my colleagues who gives presentations to management consulting clients, you know, about how to do price discrimination in general. And this is the implementation side of price discrimination. It's kind of the crux of it, because if you know, you could have the people who are willing to pay the most, crowding out the people and getting the low prices, you don't get away with it. You can't charge differentiated price schedules. I mean, this is how you do it, right? You know, whether it be pricing for add-ons or things like that. That's how life works, right? Yeah. Other questions? Yes.
I like that slide when you were talking about the possible motivations.
Yeah.
I wondered if they ever just said it to their shareholders, because they kind of did two things. They have this seat policy, but then they also, you said they also are running a lot more service than their competitors, right? So did they ever just say, we're trying to keep flights in the air? We're trying to achieve some objective?
So there were interviews with Bastian, who's the CEO of Delta, who gave interviews to primarily trade publications during the, and if you read those interviews, they make 2 points. One, keeping pilots current, right? Which I think, you know, American seem to have done a very bad job of. United did a very good job of, even though they pulled back their schedules by basically having an agreement with their union that they had more people flying, but each person flew a lot less, but enough to keep them current.
Yeah.
Okay. And so I think United managed it very well. Their Bastian also made a point along the lines of a market share gain in a longer term perspective, which is there were people who would come and sample our products who we hope like what they saw, it just in general that we would get loyalty in the long run.
Maybe they sign up for the program. And
right, exactly. Right, or they say, you know, I'm willing to forego the fact that I've been an American Advantage member for 40 years and now I'm going to consider Delta. So, I mean, presumably the proof will be whether in the long run Delta strengthens its position or whether it's gains financially in the long run on that. Right? So,
well, I also wonder, you mentioned the union, they're also kind of a player here. I imagine they prefer this because there's less furloughs and stuff, right?
It would be, right. I mean, but what you have to do at United, for example, is negotiate the fact that each person will do a lot less flying, but you will not. Okay. Right. So everybody was maintain their minimum FAA requirements, right? So I mean, so there is this sort of management side to that, if you like, right? But I mean, it just surprised me actually the amount of what they did on the schedule. I mean, when I looked at the data, it was clear a couple of things. United entrenched a lot in terms of flights. American expanded their flights very quickly. You can just look at the standards Bureau of Transportation Statistics data, expanded their flights very quickly soon after the first wave of the pandemic, but then pulled it back again to push up the load factors. So it's clear that probably Americans being very thoughtful about what extra capacity they would be introducing things, right? And then you got the question of, we did see this, I heard colleagues of mine talk to people about in this discussion, how quick your recovery was going to be. Did you need to be in a position to be able to roll out capacity quickly? So what happened this summer? Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. I was wondering if the data you brought for the analysis is publicly available or is it required?
Analysis is entirely publicly available. So the data is off the ticket data, which we use for market share as well, is what's called DB1B. DB1B, database 1B, which is the domestic ticket database. You could go on your laptop now and take this data down. It's big, right? It's a 10% ticket size. So every ticket when you buy an airline ticket, back in the days when you actually declared the ticket, if the number ended, I think, in 0, goes to the government doesn't have your name and things, but it has your itinerary, price you pay, and things like that. So you do have to do a bunch of things. Like, for example, on many of these routes, Delta is a Delta route operated by what looks like a Delta flight, but ExpressJet or SkyWest is actually operating in this Delta connection. And on many of these routes, it's mixed together. The 9 o'clock in the morning is operated by Delta mainline, the 10:30 is operated by SkyWest. And this database shows who the operating carrier is and who the ticketing carrier is. So you do have to be, and Max did all this stuff. So I'm grateful for him for doing this. So he's not for the faint-hearted. So there is an element of acquired knowledge before you get into them. And this is a widely used database, publicly available. Other question. We have a few more minutes here before any questions from the online community? Yeah, go. Yes, sir.
Professor, when you were doing your analysis of the different routes, you treated all of them equally.
No, there were route fixed effects.
Yes. But do you think that there might be a difference if you consider places like Texas and Florida, where people might be more willing to travel and more price sensitive?
So what we did was we did run those against putting in variables measuring vaccine take-up and route length and recovery, which how much the routes turned up, which of course was identifying places, flying to Tampa or something, right? Suddenly, these routes were back at 100% to the capacity by there, right? Flights to Washington, D.C. or Boston, right, were, down at 20% or something, right? So there was a variety of things there which we could use with continuous variables. When you only have 54 routes, you can't exactly segment these in any sort of way, because you're not doing that with too many observations. But what I said was disappointing was the fact I was thinking, we were hoping that we would find that parts of the country where vaccine take-up was very swift and high, there would be places where Delta was able to maybe charge a higher price, but if nothing else, at least get a bigger market share going out of this, right? And that didn't happen.
Just to follow up on that, do you think in regions where there's a higher vaccine take-up, people will be more hesitant to travel in general?
We could do that. Whenever we were dealing with market share, we were not dealing with physical sides of the market. So if this was a demand model, where the left-hand side was the number of trips in the quarter, absolutely what you say, right? But this was market share. So sure, the pie got smaller, but we're seeing what the size delta was of the pie, irrespective of
But would the nature of the market itself change?
Oh, it would do. And the big issue here that I pointed out was that the routes that had the biggest gain were routes in which, when I actually looked at the data, the people who were gaining the market share here, where Delta to some extent, America and the United particularly, were losing, were Southwest and Spirit and Sun Country and things, because these were this was Minneapolis to Tampa or something like that, right? And it was very noticeable. Here's kind of a transportation. Right? Normally, if you said to you, what's a high value trip? In normal times, it'd be business trips. Lawyers would be willing to pay lots to go off and lobby the government, right? To drive to DC and charge a high price for it. These would be the high value trips, right? And people going on vacation would be a low value trip. But during the pandemic, this was totally flipped, right? You could do your business meeting on Zoom, but you couldn't go and sit on Fort Walton Beach, right, by Zoom, right? Or ski at Vail on Zoom, right? So, so we saw that the routes which had the highest recovery tended to be the Colorado, Florida of this world, right? So the traditional business vacations, whether it be in the Northeast or San Francisco, these ones really got happened in terms of much smaller ones. You get to see that when you look at the actual definition. Are we at time here with people? I get cut off, right? So, we good? So, hey, to everyone out there in the megaverse, right? Thank you for attending and not coming out to Sunny Rantoul to see me, right? And, for those who did come in person, it's really nice to talk to people in person, right? So, and, I'm going to be around this afternoon, so I think we're going to get a chance to talk one-on-one anyway, right? So thanks very much. Okay.